So here I have the raw edge of the binding lined up with the raw edge of the quilt, and I'm leaving a tail of about 8 inches. Okay, so you can see there's an 8-inch free space to here. All right, and now we're going to start sewing. One thing I want to mention, the binding that I'm using is flannel, and also the quilt is flannel front and back. So I did cut my binding a little bit wider than normal, cut it at 2 3/4 of an inch, only because I need it for the thickness of the fabric. Now you'll notice also that I did not pin my binding to the quilt. I did not go around and see that the joins of the binding would actually fall at a corner. If they do, I just go around the corner without worrying about that. All right, so now let's get started. And I'm just using my 1/4 inch foot because I have a built-in walking foot on this machine. If I did not, then I would be using a external walking foot, okay? But I have an IDF or ID built-in walking foot, basically. So I am going to sew with a little larger than a 1/4 inch seam. And I'm going to sew for about 6 inches. Okay, and then I'm going to cut my threads. And let's take a look. All right, so let's have a look now. Let's do the little test. So I've taken the quilt completely out of the machine, and you can see the stitches here that attached the binding to the back of the quilt. So what we're looking at now, this is the front of the quilt, okay? Here is the back of the quilt with the binding. So I'm going to bring this over so that we see the front, and I'm going to take that binding and give it a little, kind of pull in the back and bring it over to the front. Now what I'm looking for is, has that binding covered the stitches that I used to sew the binding on? So if I'm going to roll this back just a little bit, there's that stitching, and you see how that binding is nicely covering those stitches. If the binding was like so, and you can see some of those stitches peeking out, then that seam allowance is too big and the binding will not cover it. And if the binding goes really far over, then the binding seam allowance is too small, okay? So this is what we're testing for right here. Is this width of this seam allowance? So from here to here, is it correct for the width of the binding that we're using? So if your binding is 2 inches, 2 1/4, in my case 2 3/4, you have to adjust that binding width accordingly, okay? So again, we're flipping it over so that I will be able to stitch right along the edge here and cover the stitching, and that's what I'm looking for. Okay, so I've put the quilt back under the machine. So again, wrong side and my binding, raw edges lined up. Know that my seam allowance is okay, and in this instance, I'm using the edge of my 1/4 inch piecing foot as the guide. Remember, my binding is wider. Because the binding is wider, there will be a different seam allowance for whatever. Every quilt should be slightly different, or you want to test for every quilt. All right, so now we're just going to sew down to the corner. And as I am sewing, I am just pulling. So I'm just pulling that binding a little bit just to put a bit of tension on it. And now we're going to get down to the corner where we're going to do the miter. So you're just going to continue along. And you notice I'm not pinning. There's no need to pin. Just give a little bit of tension on that binding. Now, as I approach the corner, I want to stop. Just put my needle in the down position. I want to stop whatever that seam allowance is. It's about 3/8 of an inch. I want to stop 3/8 of an inch from the bottom here. And I usually just feel that. I put my finger there and I just judge it by eye. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then I'm going to use my tie off so that it's going to fix a knot. And then I would cut my thread, and I'm going to take it completely out of the machine. Okay, now to make that mitered corner on the back, so this is the first miter section that we're doing, taking that binding, and you're going to take it north so that the lines, the raw edges, are still parallel, okay? And you want to pull it tight against that seam, that anchoring seam that we just did, okay? And then I want to bring this down so that it is, again, parallel, these edges here, and I want it to be parallel along this edge, so I'll tuck that in a little bit, and I want it to be parallel along the top. If I have any excess up here, this is going to cause problems. It'll give me a pointy binding, not a square one, and if it's not lined up here properly, it's going to be rounded. Okay, so if I bring in too much, if this isn't right at the top, it'll be rounded. All right, and once I have that corner all lined up, then I'm going to go back into my machine, start close to the edge, use my tie off to anchor the end of that stitch, and then I'm just going to keep stitching all the way around the edge of this quilt. Again, you notice I'm not pinning. I'm just going to get my quilt organized, going to give a little bit of tension on the front. I line up about, you can't quite see that, I'm going to line up about 6 inches. So about 6 inches in front here. Give it a slight bit of tug, make sure that everything is tight, and then just sew. And when I get to the end of that, needle stops in the down position to hold it. Get the next 6 inches lined up. And you can't see it very well here, but my binding, let me see if we just back out a little bit. You can't see, but my binding is not twisting as it's coming out of this little bundle here. Okay, so the next 6 inches is lined up, and I'm just going to sew. And I would continue lining up the next 6 inches, a little bit of tension, do those mitered corners until I get all the way around to the beginning, and then we'll do the final join. So I've sewn all the way around the quilt, and I have now reached the beginning tail. So there is about 12 inches from where my needle is currently down here to where I first started. So I'm just going to stop sewing. I'm going to cut my threads and take the quilt out of the machine so I can do the final join. All right, so to do the final join, I have a little ruler that I'm using, I have 2 pins, and I have a pair of scissors. Now, the first thing that I want to do is, if I have a selvage edge on the beginning tail, I want to get rid of it. And I do have a selvage tail, so I will just cut it off. Okay, and then I'm going to take the end tail and place it over top of the beginning so that I can just see a little bit of the beginning popping through there. Just see if we can zoom in a little bit so you can see better. Okay, so then what I will do is I'm going to take my ruler and place it over top so that it's lined up with the bottom, because I want the top to overlap the bottom by the width of the binding. Now in this case, my binding is 2 3/4 of an inch. So I will my measurement here is 2 3/4. So from the end of the original, the beginning, over to here is 2 3/4. And I'm going to just put a little snip in there. And then I can take the ruler away and make this final cut. And you want to try to make those cuts square, because that's what you're going to use to join the ends up. Okay? All right, so once we have that done, and this is the part a lot of people get confused, and there are other ways to do that measurement. This is what I have found has been the easiest way. Now, in order to not twist your binding as you do the final join, you're going to take the one on the right-hand side, and you're going to just open it up and place it face up like so. Okay, so you see there is no twist. This is just coming around and turning the corner. Okay, if it had a twist in it, it would look like this. So open it up and bring it, I say north, or just bring it up above the quilt. And then you're going to take the end binding and you're going to open it up as well. And now I need to take this side and place it face down over there. But because of part of that is up north, I can't see that. Or they won't line up. So I'm just going to take and scrunch the quilt up a little bit so that I can place the two of them on top of each other. And this will now be exactly like a join that I did at the beginning when I was joining all the strips together. So you see how I have them lined up? Again, if you scrunch that quilt up a little bit more, you've got more room to work. All right. And then we're going to take 2 pins, and I'm going to pin on the diagonal. So I'm pinning where I would be sewing that diagonal seam. Okay, so do you see that? So from this corner up here down to the corner there, so that this is basically the same mitered corner you would make if you were sewing regular, like a join. And then the test is open this up and see that that binding is not twisted. Okay, so it's super, super easy. Just take the one on the right and flip it open with the right side up. Take the one on the left and flip it open with the right side facing down, and then just match the two of them up. And then do this little test to make sure that it's not twisted and that that binding is approximately the right length. And then all you'll do is go to your sewing machine, and you're going to sew a seam right down here. We're going to trim that, press it open, and then come back and finish that seam off. Okay, so that's what we're going to do next. All right, so I'm back at the sewing machine, and it's a little bit harder now to see where I'm supposed to stop and start. So I may have to just jiggle that a little bit to get everything lined up. And you can always put a pin right at the corner where you're supposed to start. You can mark this if you'd like. If you do have a projection line on your machine, you can turn that on. We'll just quickly turn this on, get rid of the grid, and now I can see a projection line that's going to come down here. You may not be able to see it on the camera, and I'm going to start to sew. There's that projection line. Or you can just eyeball it. It's not a very long seam. Take these pins out as you're going and sew down to the corner. All right, and one thing I just want to remind you, did you notice how I had the quilt kind of all scrunched as I was doing that sewing? So I'm sewing that seam to make the final join, and the quilt is all scrunched together. Okay, so that's just to make it easier to do that. So now I have my scissors. I'm going to just take and trim that away. Oh, you know what? I've already started, but another thing that you can do at this point is do the test again. So you see how when I pull that out, the binding is not twisted, and it's going to fill that gap of the quilt. So now I can finish trimming. Like so. And now I'm going to take and press that seam open and just repress this part. So we'll be right back. Okay, so here I have pressed the seam open. Now the other thing that I'm going to do is take that and, oops, we'll just lay it like this, and just give it another press right where that join is on the fold. I just want it to be nice and crisp, so when I go to applique it onto the quilt, it's going to work really well. And now there is that seam join, and the final thing is to, I'll just move out here so you can see that, we're going to go back to the machine and finish off and stitch down this loose edge. So I'm back at the sewing machine, and I'm going to just finish sewing that loose edge to the quilt. And you'll notice as I'm getting back to the finish here, or to the starting point, there is no tucks and no puckers, no excess binding. That's why it's really important to measure that final join and get it exactly right so that it will lie flat when you get back to the beginning. And now we're ready to flip the binding over to the right side of the quilt, and we're going to applique it in place. I must find some thread colors first, and we'll be back to show you that. All right, let's have a look at the thread colors. So I have chosen a dark blue. Oops, let's get that on the camera here. So I have a dark blue that I'm going to use in the bobbin for the back. Now I'm using a striped fabric for the binding, which is really hard to find a matching color. I could use invisible thread. I am not a fan of invisible thread, so I have here a lighter blue that I'm going to use, and it will show a little bit. You can see the thread there showing up, but you know what? This is a child's quilt. I'm not really that worried about it. If it were a quilt with a solid fabric on it for a binding, then I would find a thread that matched that color. Now I'm ready to sew the binding on, or it's basically appliquing the binding onto the front of the quilt. So you will see a little seam running along here, and that's perfectly fine. So again, when I pull this binding over from the back, I want to pull it over just slightly, and I will actually measure it with a thumb or my thumbnail or fingernail so that the binding is pulled over just a smidgen more than that seam, so that when I'm stitching, I'm basically stitching in the ditch on the back, okay, because I can feel it. So the other tool that I will use when I get to the corner is my stiletto, and I have changed the thread so that I have that sort of medium blue on the front or on the top, and then I've got that darker blue in the bobbin. Okay, so now we're going to just, and I'm going to start close to a corner so I can show you how to do the miter as well. So we're just going to stitch, and you see what I've done here is I've just pulled over about 2 inches, and I'm going to sew that 2 inches. And I want to use my needle in the down position as well. So and all I'm doing is I'm using my hands underneath to just pull that binding over to the front. There's no need to iron it. I've never ironed a binding. And I'm just going to keep sewing. And as I said, I can feel with my thumbnail when I have passed the binding on the back, and I also have a visual with the seam allowance. And it may happen sometimes that you do go on, you know, if your seam allowance isn't even the first time, then you may end up where you're going to stitch on the binding on the back. It's not the end of the world. Okay, now as I'm getting close to the corner here, how am I going to make the miter? First thing I'm doing is I'm just going to clean up the threads from when I stitched the other part of the binding on. Let's get rid of those. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to form the miter right here. I'll try to keep my hands out of the way for you. So I'm going to flip that binding so that it looks like this. Okay, so I've just pulled that fabric to the front. I'm going to start by the bottom. So let me just see if we can zoom in a little bit here so you can see what I am doing. All right, so I'm going to, again, bring this out. Use your fingers to manipulate it to the max. And you're going to fold up the bottom first. Okay, so I'm folding up the bottom and leaving this side like so. And then I'm going to take the top and flip it over like that. So that will create a nice little miter corner here. And you'll have to manipulate it sometimes in order to get it exactly lined up. Because what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the two corners to meet right where the end of my stiletto is. All right. Now I'm a little bit far from the corner, so I'm just going to go back, get a little closer. And now flip that up. We're going to flip this over. And it's very difficult for me to hold that with my hands. So this is where I will use my stiletto to hold it. Again, I want to keep control of where that binding is going to go. And I'm stitching. And you see how my stiletto can go right under the needle. I know that's a little bit far up in the camera there, but it can go right under. And I want to pivot the minute that that needle hits the bottom part of this binding. And I'll just move that up a little bit so you can see where I am. Okay. So the minute that the needle hits this bottom part of the binding is when it's time to pivot. And then all I do is I'm going to pivot, fold over the next part of the binding, and as I keep going around, I literally will just bring over a few inches, and that's how I sew the binding on. Get the mitered corners without having to pin or clip or iron or anything. It's really quite simple. So I'm going to go and finish around the edge of the quilt, and then we'll come back and have a look at it. So one other thing before we get to see what it looks like on the back. One other thing I'm just noticing that I'm doing with my hand. So as I'm pulling this over, and the camera was in the way before, but as I bring this binding over, I'm actually holding it with my two fingernails. And this, as I mentioned before about my fingernails are holding it just beyond the thickness of the binding on the back. So it is just the width of my fingernail basically, which is just that scant little distance more than, so that the front will be wider than the back. And same thing, I'm just rolling it over and holding it in place like that as a guide. All right, so now the binding is finished. You can see the binding is on the quilt. Whoops, there's the binding. Okay. So let's have a look at what it looks like. Let's zoom in. Okay, so here you can see the binding, and my stitching is a little bit wonky because it is a flannel quilt and it is a little bit of a challenge, but that's what it's going to look like on the front. And let's have a peek at the back. So here's that same corner, So you can see the dark stitching right along the edge, right along the edge. So you're right in the ditch, basically on the back, and there's a nice mitered corner. So it is super easy to put that binding on by machine and to have it look nice on the front and the back. And like I said, because of the coloring of this quilt, where we have that multicolor, it does look a little bit out of sorts, but it really isn't a big deal at all. Again, given the fact that this is a child's quilt, matching thread on a regular binding would be just fine. I hope that helps, and thanks for watching.